Imagine hiring a cleaning lady for a quiet afternoon, only to get a phone call that changes everything. "Ma'am," she whispers, trembling, "there's someone in your house." What would you do? For Simone Whitlock, that call became the beginning of a descent into secrets darker than any nightmare. Behind the polished walls of her Savannah home hid something she could never have imagined, a truth buried beneath decades of lies, love, and betrayal. As police searched and found nothing, the unease only grew. Strange noises from the attic, food disappearing from the fridge, a light flickering at night where no one should be, and the husband who always had the perfect explanation, but the truth, it was waiting upstairs, breathing, watching, and writing. This is the true story of the ghost in the attic. A tale of silence, manipulation, and the terrifying lengths people go to hide their sins. It began as one of those peaceful mornings where nothing feels out of place, the kind of day that tricks you into believing life is simple, predictable, safe. Simone Whitlock had woken early, determined to clean the house before the heavy Savannah rains returned. The air smelled of salt and magnolia. Sunlight danced lazily across the window panes. She moved through her home humming softly, a rag in one hand, a sense of calm in her heart. That peace lasted until the phone in her pocket buzzed. Eve, the screen read, her childhood friend, the one she hadn't seen in years. They spoke with warmth and laughter that instantly revived old memories. Eve invited her for coffee at a little cafe by the magnolia trees, and for a moment Simone hesitated. The house still needed work. But then she remembered Brianna Parrish, a gentle, hard-working college student who lived nearby and sometimes helped her clean. A quick call later, Brianna had agreed to come over, grateful for the extra money. Simone left her a spare key, a list of simple chores, and a reminder to be careful with the shelves in her husband's study. Nothing seemed unusual. Life, in that quiet coastal town, still felt ordinary, until the phone rang again. She answered with a smile, expecting Brianna to say she was finished. But instead, she heard something that made the blood drain from her face. "Miss Simone," came the whisper, fragile and trembling. "Is there anyone else in the house?" Simone froze, her breath caught in her chest. "No, why?" she asked. A pause, then a sound like shallow shaking breaths. "There's a woman upstairs." The words hit like ice water. For a few seconds, the world seemed to tilt. Simone's hand trembled as she clutched the phone tighter. "Get out," she commanded, her voice rising despite her panic. "Lock the door and wait outside, right now." The cafe around her blurred into meaningless noise, clinking cups, muffled chatter, the hum of life continuing as her own heart thundered. She barely remembers saying goodbye to Eve. She barely remembers starting the car. The only thing she could hear was Brianna's frightened voice echoing in her mind. "There's a woman upstairs." The drive home felt endless, the Savannah streets a blur of rain-streaked color. When Simone finally pulled into the driveway, a police car was already waiting, its lights flashing like a warning heartbeat against the old brick walls. Brianna sat on the front steps, pale, shaking, her eyes hollow with terror. The officers searched the house top to bottom, every room, every closet, every dark corner where fear might hide. Nothing. No signs of forced entry, no broken locks, not even a footprint out of place. "It's clear," one officer said flatly. But Brianna kept insisting, her voice trembling. "I swear she was there. She had long white hair and a dress. I saw her walk down the hall and disappear." Simone listened, torn between disbelief and dread. Her home, built more than 70 years ago, had always creaked and whispered like old houses do. But she had never felt unsafe, not until now. When her husband Jerome arrived minutes later, she expected panic, concern, something. Instead, he smiled faintly, almost indulgently. "Sweetheart, it's an old house," he said. "The light can play tricks. Shadows look like people when you're tired." His calmness should have soothed her. Instead, it only deepened the unease twisting inside her chest. She looked at Brianna, a sensible girl with no reason to lie, and saw in her eyes the raw, unfiltered fear of someone who had truly seen something. Still, Simone apologized to the police for the false alarm. She paid Brianna and told her to rest. Yet, as she closed the door that night, the silence in the house felt heavier than ever, pressing down on her like invisible hands. That night, Simone lay awake listening to the clock tick in the darkness, each second louder than the last. She replayed the call over and over in her head, the whisper, the pause, the panic. What if it hadn't been a shadow? What if someone really was in the house? She thought of the attic, the narrow staircase that creaked like bones, the dusty study filled with her husband's old manuscripts and locked drawers she had never opened. She told herself it was nothing, that the police had checked everything. Yet deep down, a voice she couldn't silence whispered that the story wasn't over. Outside, the wind howled softly through the oaks, carrying with it the faintest echo of something moving above the ceiling. Simone stared into the darkness, her pulse quickening. Somewhere in that house, in the walls that had held her family for decades, a secret was waiting, one that had just stirred awake. The days following the incident felt unreal. Simone tried to convince herself that everything was fine, that Brianna's frightened eyes and trembling voice were just the echoes of an overworked imagination, but the silence of the house had changed. It no longer hummed softly with comfort, it listened. Every sound seemed sharper, more deliberate, a floorboard sighing, a faint tap above the ceiling, the distant creak of a door she hadn't opened. At breakfast, Simone found herself pausing mid-sip of coffee, head tilted toward the upper floor. Old wood expands in humidity, Jerome said with a laugh when she mentioned it. You know how these houses breathe. He buried himself again in the newspaper, his tone gentle but dismissive, as if her unease were an amusing quirk. She forced a smile, but a knot formed in her chest. The noises weren't random. Some nights she heard soft shuffles, others a dragging sound, like a chair scraping across the attic floor. And always, right after the noises stopped, came that impossible stillness, the kind that feels like someone holding their breath just beyond your sight. A week later, the strange disturbances began to take on form. Food went missing, a half loaf of bread one morning, a wedge of cheese another. Then the cold cuts Simone had wrapped carefully in paper vanished from the fridge, leaving only the faintest trace of a knife mark. She asked Jerome if he'd taken them, already knowing the answer. Maybe I got hungry, he replied without looking up, flipping a page of his manuscript with a slow, deliberate gesture. They were good. The lie was gentle, effortless, and that frightened her most. Jerome hated spicy food. He couldn't even bear the smell of paprika. Yet he said it so naturally that Simone doubted her own memory. That night, she stood before the refrigerator door long after he went to bed, staring at the empty space on the shelf as if it might confess. She thought of Brianna again, of her whisper about the woman in white. For a moment, she considered calling her back, asking her to describe exactly what she'd seen. But the memory of Jerome's mild, knowing smile stopped her. The next morning, the attic was quiet again. Too quiet. One rainy afternoon, Simone's exhaustion turned to determination. She couldn't shake the feeling that the house was hiding something. She went from room to room, cleaning furiously, as if scrubbing away her own fear. When she reached Jerome's study, the one room he always insisted she'll leave alone, she hesitated. Dust covered everything. The oak shelves lined with his books, the typewriter he kept for inspiration, the framed newspaper article celebrating his latest novel. She ran a finger across the desk. A small drawer beneath the stack of papers refused to open. She tugged once, twice, then suddenly with a loud click, it gave way. Inside lay a worn leather notebook, its corners frayed, its pages filled with elegant handwriting that was undeniably feminine. Simone frowned. Jerome never wrote by hand. He mocked the idea of ink and paper. She turned the pages, her heart pounding faster with each line. They weren't diary entries. They were story outlines, fragments of novels, ideas that mirrored the very themes in Jerome's published works. Her throat went dry. Who had written this? And why was it hidden here, beneath his drafts? She shut the drawer quickly, pulse racing, a sick realization blooming in her mind. Whatever the truth was, Jerome had buried it in ink and lies. That night, Simone barely slept. Each creak of the house sounded like footsteps, each gust of wind like a whisper calling her name. When the clock struck 2, she heard it again, a faint scraping above her, rhythmic and patient. She sat up, eyes wide in the dark, her breath quick and shallow. For a long moment, she listened. The noise stopped, replaced by a deep, unnatural stillness. Then came another sound, the slow creak of the attic door at the end of the hall. Simone's blood ran cold. She reached for the lamp, but froze, afraid that the light might draw whatever was up there toward her. Instead, she whispered into the dark, barely moving her lips. "Jerome?" No answer. The door clicked shut again, soft but deliberate. Simone lay back, trembling, staring at the ceiling she no longer trusted. Something or someone was living in her walls. And though she didn't know it yet, the truth waiting above her head would destroy every certainty she had ever known. Morning light filtered weakly through the curtains, casting pale bars across the study floor. Simone sat at Jerome's desk, the leather notebook laid out before her like a forbidden relic. She had spent the night turning it over in her mind, that delicate handwriting, so unlike her husband's rigid scrawl and the stories that felt hauntingly familiar. Every line read like a memory she hadn't lived but somehow knew. She opened the notebook again, unable to resist. The scent of aged paper rose like a ghost from the past. Inside were dozens of pages written in soft looping penmanship, story fragments, character sketches, and detailed plot lines. Many bore uncanny resemblances to Jerome's best-selling novels. One passage described a woman trapped in an old house, hearing whispers in the walls, almost word for word from The Shaded Widow, the novel that had launched his career. Simone's stomach twisted. These weren't coincidences. Someone had written these before him. But who? Her fingers trembled as she traced the faded ink. The realization was sharp, almost cruel. Her husband's greatest talent might have never been his own. That day, she tried to act normal, but her mind couldn't let go of what she'd found. She made breakfast, watered the plants, and smiled when Jerome kissed her cheek. But inside, a storm churned. As he left for the day, claiming he needed to meet with the publisher, Simone's eyes followed him to the door. She could tell his mind was elsewhere. His once kind gaze now felt distant, unreadable, as if he were performing the role of a loving husband rather than living it. When the car disappeared down the street, Simone returned to the study. She flipped through the notebook again, this time looking for clues. Near the back, she found a page marked with an old ribbon. The handwriting there was shakier, as though written under stress. It spoke of a small coastal town, a sister waiting for someone who would never return, and a man who hid the truth beneath the house. Simone froze. The words struck too close to home. The mention of a sister lingered in her chest, echoing like a voice from a dream she couldn't place. For reasons she couldn't explain, her eyes filled with tears. The name signed at the bottom of the final page was almost illegible, a loop of letters beginning with A. That night, she decided to confront Jerome, not directly, but quietly. She needed to understand who he truly was before accusing him of deception. As evening fell, she watched him move through the house like a stranger occupying her husband's skin. He spoke softly, smiled occasionally, but there was a subtle tension behind every gesture, as if his entire existence balanced on a secret he couldn't afford to let slip. After dinner, he announced, "I'll be in the study for a few hours. The new draft is killing me." Simone nodded, pretending to be tired. She waited until the familiar sound of his typing echoed down the hallway, then slipped out of bed and crept toward the staircase. The light beneath the study door glowed faintly. She pressed her ear against it, her heartbeat thunderous in her ears. But what she heard wasn't the clacking of keys. It was whispering, Jerome's voice, low and urgent, as though speaking to someone. She couldn't make out the words, only the tone pleading, almost apologetic. Then, a pause. A faint creak followed, like footsteps moving above her. The attic. Simone stepped back, her pulse racing, her mind struggling to deny the impossible. Jerome wasn't alone. At dawn, she awoke in bed to find Jerome beside her, asleep, calm, and untroubled. But the faint smell of smoke lingered on his clothes, old candle wax, the kind they long stopped using. Simone rose quietly and walked to the window. The attic window, visible from the garden, was slightly ajar, its curtain fluttering weakly in the morning breeze. The memory of Brianna's trembling voice came back in a rush. "There's a woman upstairs." A chill crept through Simone's bones. She now knew two things with absolute certainty. Someone else had been in that attic, and Jerome was hiding it. She looked once more at the notebook, lying where she left it on the desk. The initials AW seemed clearer now in the morning light. And as she traced them with her fingertip, she whispered the only name that fit. A name she hadn't spoken aloud in 30 years. Alana. Her sister. The one who had vanished without a trace. The moment Simone whispered her sister's name, the world seemed to stop breathing. Alana. That single word carried 1,000 buried memories, laughter echoing through childhood fields, late-night confessions, and the heartbreak of a disappearance that had shattered an entire family. Everyone had believed Alana was gone forever, swallowed by time and rumor. Yet here, in the house Simone shared with her husband, a shadow of her presence lingered, hidden in ink, in whispers, in the dark pulse of the attic above. For hours, Simone sat frozen in Jerome's study, staring at the notebook as dawn spilled across the floorboards like quiet revelation. Was it possible? Could her sister be alive? Or had Jerome stolen her words, her voice, her very identity? The thought twisted inside her like something alive. The house felt smaller now, its walls heavier, its silence more suffocating. Even the air seemed charged, like it knew what she was about to do. By the time night fell again, Simone had made her decision. She was going to the attic. Not tomorrow, not later tonight. Whatever waited above that ceiling, truth or ghost, she would face it alone. The clock read 11:58 p.m. when Simone climbed out of bed. Jerome's steady breathing filled the dark room. His hand rested loosely on her side, a familiar weight that now felt like restraint. She slipped free and stood barefoot on the cold wooden floor. The house was silent except for the slow rhythmic ticking of the hallway clock. Simone walked quietly, careful not to let the boards groan beneath her steps. The attic door loomed at the end of the corridor, a small square in the ceiling with an old metal latch, half hidden by shadows. She fetched the folding ladder from the storage room, its rusted hinges groaning softly as she dragged it into place. The silence was unbearable. Even her own breathing sounded intrusive. With trembling hands, she reached up and unlatched the hatch. It resisted at first, then released with a dull click, and a breath of cold, stale air swept down, thick with the scent of dust and old paper. For a long moment, she simply stood there, frozen beneath the opening, her heart hammering so loud she thought it might wake Jerome. Then, gripping the sides of the ladder, she began to climb. Each step creaked under her weight, as though warning her to turn back. The beam from her phone's flashlight cut through the darkness, slicing across boxes and faded trunks blanketed in years of dust. The attic stretched farther than she remembered, a maze of forgotten furniture and shadows. And then, at the far end, she saw it, a faint glow. Not from her phone, not from any window, but from a flickering oil lamp resting on a small wooden table. Simone's breath caught. The glow revealed the outline of a woman seated with her back turned, long silvered hair cascading down a thin frame. For a moment Simone couldn't move. She wanted to call out, but her throat felt sealed shut by disbelief. Finally, in a whisper that barely escaped her lips, she said, "Hello?" The woman flinched. The pencil in her hand slipped and rolled across the floor. Slowly she turned her head, and in the dim lamplight, Simone saw a face she thought she'd never see again. Gaunt, pale, but unmistakably familiar. "Sister!" The woman croaked, her voice dry and trembling. Sister Simone. The world tilted. Simone staggered forward, tears welling instantly. Alana? She whispered, half prayer, half gasp. Oh my God. Alana! What followed felt like a dream that teetered between horror and grace. Simone rushed forward, falling to her knees beside her sister. Alana's hands were skeletal, her eyes hollowed but glimmering with recognition. The attic around them told a story words could never fully hold. Piles of handwritten manuscripts stacked neatly in one corner, an old blanket folded on a thin mattress, empty cans arranged in quiet shame. Simone touched her sister's cheek, felt the coldness of skin that had forgotten sunlight. What happened to you? She whispered, her voice breaking under the weight of 30 lost years. Alana only shook her head, tears spilling silently as she reached for her sister's hand. He said it was to protect you, she murmured. He said, no one could ever know. Before Simone could speak, a floorboard creaked below, heavy, deliberate, too close. They froze. The sound of slow footsteps echoed through the house beneath them. Jerome was awake. Simone met her sister's terrified eyes, and in that instant she understood. The attic wasn't just a hiding place, it was a prison, and the man sleeping beside her all those years was its warden. The air in the attic grew colder as the sound of footsteps faded down the hallway below. Simone and Alana sat frozen, two silhouettes trembling beneath the flickering lamplight. It was the first time they had seen each other in 3 decades, yet the moment didn't feel like a reunion, it felt like a haunting. Alana's eyes darted toward the floorboards, wide and fearful. He doesn't know I spoke to you, she whispered, her voice fragile but urgent. He comes here at night, when you're asleep. He brings food, paper, candles. He said the world forgot me, and that you couldn't bear to know. Simone's heart pounded painfully in her chest. Every word felt like a blade carving truth into her soul. He told me you ran away, Simone breathed, struggling to steady her voice. He said you were gone forever. Alana shook her head weakly, tears glistening in the dim light. I never left, sister. I was here. He locked me up the night I begged him to tell you the truth. The confession cracked something inside Simone, grief, rage, disbelief, all colliding in one unbearable surge. She stared at the ceiling beams, realizing the house she thought she'd known was a coffin for her sister's stolen life. When Elena began to speak again, her words flowed slowly, painfully, as though each memory was a stone she had to lift from her chest. It started 30 years ago, she said, her gaze lost in the shadows. I had just signed with a new editor, Darren Albright. He promised to publish my first novel, but when I went to his apartment to discuss the draft, everything went wrong. Simone listened, her breath shallow as Alana described the night that destroyed her life, a desperate struggle, a blow struck in panic, and Darren collapsing lifeless on the floor. I wanted to call the police, Alana whispered, shaking, but Jerome came in before I could. He said he'd help me, that he'd take care of everything for you. He said turning myself in would ruin your life too. Her voice broke on the last words. He buried Darren's body in the woods and brought me here. He said it would only be for a few weeks, just until things settled. Simone's eyes burned with tears as the horror unfolded. Her husband had not only hidden a crime, he had built his success on it. But why keep you here? She whispered. Why all these years? Alana looked at her sister with a mixture of sorrow and shame. Because he found my notebooks, she said softly. He realized he could use them. Every book he ever wrote. Every story people praised him for, they were mine. The attic fell into silence except for the faint, steady drip of rain against the roof. Simone felt dizzy, as if the air itself had turned against her. All those nights she had watched Jerome at his desk, proud of his supposed genius, all the interviews, the awards, the applause, every moment had been built on Elena's imprisonment. He said it was for love, Alana continued bitterly, clutching her hands together. He said if I stayed hidden, no one would hurt you. He made me believe I was protecting you by disappearing. Simone pressed a trembling hand over her mouth to keep from crying out. The man who shared her bed had weaponized love into control, chaining two women to a lie that spanned decades. "He's not your savior," Simone said through clenched teeth, her voice trembling with fury. "He's a thief. A coward." Alana nodded, her expression hollow. "He's coming back soon," she murmured. "He said he's leaving for Atlanta, but that's what he always says before he hides something." The words lingered like smoke. Somewhere beneath them, a door clicked shut. The sound was faint but certain. Jerome was home. Simone's body moved before her mind could catch up. She grabbed Alana's thin wrist and whispered, "We're leaving, now." But Alana shook her head violently. "He'll hear us. You don't know what he's capable of." "I don't care," Simone hissed. "You've lived like a ghost long enough." She guided her sister toward the ladder, her own heartbeat a roar in her ears. Each step felt like an act of defiance against 30 years of deception. As Alana descended, the attic light flickered, once, twice, then died completely, leaving them in darkness. Below, a voice drifted up from the shadows. Calm, familiar, terrifying. "Simone?" Jerome's tone was low, almost tender. "What are you doing up there?" Simone froze mid-step, her breath caught. For a moment, she said nothing. Then, with a steadiness she didn't know she possessed, she answered, "Finding the truth." Silence. Then a quiet chuckle, soft, sinister, resigned. "Ah," Jerome murmured, "so you finally met our little secret." Simone's hand tightened around Alana's as she whispered, "Run." And together, for the first time in 30 years, the sisters fled the darkness that had kept them apart. The next morning, the house no longer felt like home. It felt like a museum of lies. Simone sat across from her sister in the living room, sunlight spilling weakly through the blinds. Alana was wrapped in a shawl, her fragile hands cupping a mug of tea she could barely hold steady. She looked impossibly small, like someone who'd forgotten what warmth felt like. For a long time neither of them spoke. Then, softly Simone said, "Tell me everything." Alana took a shaky breath, her eyes unfocused, as if she were watching her memories play out on the walls around them. "When Jerome locked me in the attic that first night," she began, "I thought it would only be for a day or two. He told me he'd fix everything, that he'd make the police believe Darren had left town." Her voice cracked. "But days turned to months and months into years. I begged him to tell you I was alive. He said he couldn't, that it would destroy you. And every time I cried he said the same thing, 'I'm protecting you both.'" Simone felt her throat tighten. She had always thought Jerome's protectiveness was love. Now she understood it had been control. Alana stared down into her tea, her reflection trembling on the surface. "At first, I thought he would let me go once it was safe, but then he brought me notebooks. Pens, said writing would help me stay sane. I wrote stories to keep from losing my mind." She paused, a small broken laugh escaping her. "I didn't know he was stealing them. Not at first. He told me he was showing them to publishers, using my words as inspiration. And when I saw his first book, The Silent River, I recognized every line." Her voice wavered but did not break. "He had rewritten my life, Simone. Every story was mine, my pain, my dreams, my ghosts. But his name was on the cover." Simone's stomach twisted as she remembered attending his first book launch. The pride she'd felt watching her husband smile for cameras, shake hands with editors. She remembered how he dedicated the novel to "my muse, whose silence speaks louder than words." Back then, it sounded romantic. Now it was monstrous. "The attic became my world," Alana whispered. "He made it sound like a kindness, said the world outside would eat me alive. He said everyone thought I was guilty, that they'd hate me if they knew the truth. I started believing him. I became his ghost, the secret that made his genius possible." Her eyes glistened with tears, but there was defiance in her tone now. "Do you know what the worst part was, Simone? It wasn't the hunger or the cold. It was hearing you downstairs, laughing, living your life. I wanted to scream your name every time I heard you. But Jerome always knew when to come up. He'd bring food, sometimes gifts, and tell me you are happy. He made me feel like a curse, like I'd ruin your life just by being seen. Simone reached across the table, taking her sister's trembling hand in hers. He made you believe that to keep his secret, she said softly. But he doesn't get to control the story anymore. For the first time in 30 years, Alana smiled, a small, fragile smile, but real. When Brianna came that day, I panicked, she admitted. I was careless. I didn't mean for her to see me, but part of me wanted to be seen. I think I was done hiding. Simone squeezed her hand tighter. And you're done now, she said firmly. We're going to the police. We'll tell them everything. You won't live another day in the dark. Alana nodded slowly, tears sliding down her face, her voice barely a whisper. I just want to be free, Simone. Even if it's only for a little while. Outside, the first rays of sunlight broke through the storm clouds, bathing the house in pale gold. Simone looked toward the attic door, now silent, harmless, and open. For decades it had been a prison, but now it was nothing more than a space, a place that had lost its power. The sisters sat in the quiet glow of morning, hand in hand, as if trying to reclaim all the lost years from the silence that had stolen them. The decision to go to the police wasn't made lightly. That morning, as the sisters sat in the pale hush of dawn, Simone could feel the weight of every possible consequence pressing against her chest. Turning Jerome in meant destroying the man she once loved, shattering the image of the husband she had defended for decades. But keeping silent meant betraying Alana all over again. We'll tell the truth, Simone said finally, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. You've suffered long enough. It's time to end this. Alana's eyes filled with a fragile mix of fear and hope. She nodded slowly, clutching the edge of her shawl as if bracing herself for a storm. Together, they began gathering proof, the notebook, the manuscripts, the few letters Jerome had carelessly left in drawers. Each page was a piece of evidence, a voice that had been stolen and caged. Simone felt herself moving with a kind of numb focus, fueled by equal parts love and fury. She didn't just want justice. She wanted redemption, for her sister, for herself, for every quiet moment she had ignored the signs. By noon, Jerome returned. The sound of his car in the driveway made Simone's blood run cold. Alana flinched, her face going pale. He can't see me, she whispered. Simone acted fast. She led her sister to the guest room on the first floor, urging her to stay hidden. I'll handle him, she said, closing the door softly. When Jerome stepped inside, he looked almost ordinary again, the charming husband, calm and composed. You're up early, he said, his tone casual. Simone forced a smile. Just cleaning, he nodded, but his eyes swept the room like a predator checking his territory. For a few moments, silence hung heavy between them. Then he said quietly, You went up there last night, didn't you? Simone froze. What are you talking about? His expression hardened, the mask slipping for the first time. You shouldn't have done that. The air between them crackled with tension. For years, Jerome's power had been unspoken, a quiet authority built on charm and control. But now Simone saw him clearly, and something inside her shifted. You're right, she said softly. I shouldn't have waited this long. And before he could speak, she walked past him, picked up the phone, and called the police. The hours that followed blurred into a storm of motion, sirens, questions, disbelief. When the officers arrived, Simone guided them to the attic herself. Alana stood at the bottom of the stairs, trembling but resolute, ready to face whatever awaited her. The police moved carefully through the small space, documenting everything, the mattress, the papers, the lamp, the traces of a life hidden in plain sight. One officer, clearly shaken, whispered to another, 30 years. My God. Simone stayed by her sister's side, her hand never leaving Alana's. Jerome tried to speak when they let him out of the house in handcuffs, but Simone refused to look at him. The man she loved was gone, replaced by the hollow shell of a liar. As the car pulled away, Alana turned to her sister, tears glistening in her eyes. "I never thought I'd see this day," she murmured. "You gave me back my life, Simone." Simone shook her head gently, her own eyes filled with tears. "No," she whispered. "You survived long enough to reclaim it yourself." That evening, as the chaos faded and silence returned, Simone and Alana sat together in the living room, wrapped in a quiet that no longer felt oppressive. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the walls in amber light. Alana rested her head on Simone's shoulder, her body weak but her spirit finally unshackled. "What happens now?" she asked softly. Simone looked out the window, watching the last light fade over Savannah. "Now," she said, "we start over. We tell the truth, all of it." Alana nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "Promise me one thing. If something happens to me, you won't let my story die again." Simone turned to her, her eyes steady, her voice unwavering. "I promise," she said. "I'll make sure the world knows who you really are." The sisters sat together until night settled fully around the house. For the first time in 30 years, there were no secrets between them, only the quiet, sacred peace of truth. The following days passed in a blur of flashing cameras, police statements, and cold, echoing hallways. Savannah's quiet streets seemed to hum with whispers about the Whitlock house, the novelist arrested for crimes no one could have imagined. Simone watched everything unfold with an aching mix of disbelief and relief. Jerome's arrest became national news overnight. The celebrated writer, whose haunting novels had captivated millions, was now exposed as a fraud, a manipulator, and an accomplice to a decades-old crime. Outside the courthouse, reporters shouted questions as he was led inside, his wrists bound in steel. "Mr. Whitlock, is it true you kept a woman locked in your attic? Whose stories did you steal?" He said nothing. His face was a mask of weary arrogance, the same calm she had once mistaken for intellect. Simone stood beside Alana, holding her hand, shielding her from the frenzy. She could feel her sister trembling, though not from fear, from the sheer weight of being seen after 30 years of invisibility. "They're looking at me," Alana whispered, her voice small. Simone squeezed her hand. "Let them," she said softly. "You've been unseen long enough." Inside the courtroom, the truth spilled out piece by piece, each revelation darker than the last. The police found fragments of Alana's manuscripts in Jerome's desk, drafts he'd retyped and published under his own name. They discovered records of financial transfers from the publisher to Jerome dating back decades, each one a payment for words that weren't his. And then came the part that silenced the room, the excavation in the woods near the Ogeechee River, where detectives unearthed Darren Albright's remains. The cause of death matched Alana's confession perfectly. It was self-defense, her lawyer argued. And the rest, the hiding, the confinement, that was all Jerome's doing. The prosecution presented the case with precision, but even the coldest legal arguments couldn't capture the human tragedy beneath it all. When Alana took the stand, the courtroom fell utterly still. Her voice trembled, but every word carried decades of endurance. She told them everything. How Jerome manipulated her, how he convinced her that prison would be mercy compared to the world's judgment. The jury listened, many with tears in their eyes. By the time she finished, even the judge's tone had softened. Outside the courthouse, the public's sympathy turned swiftly in her favor. The ghostwriter of Savannah, the newspapers called her. For the first time, Alana's name, not Jerome's, appeared in headlines. Her courage, her writing, her survival became a symbol for those who had been silenced or erased by others' power. Simone watched it all unfold with a bittersweet pride. Justice was finally visible, but so was pain, raw, deep, and irreversible. She could see that the courtroom victories didn't erase 30 years of stolen time. Alana smiled politely for the cameras but often fell silent once they were gone, retreating into long pauses that Simone learned not to interrupt. "It's strange," Alana said one night as they sat by the window. "The world calls me brave, but I still feel like that girl in the attic sometimes, waiting for someone to open the door." Simone took her hand, her voice firm. You opened it yourself, Elena. You just needed to see it. But she could tell her sister's body was weakening. The confinement, the years of malnutrition, the stress, they had left invisible cracks no justice could mend. Weeks later, the verdict came. Jerome Whitlock, guilty on all counts. Life imprisonment without parole. The words hit Simone with a dull weight of finality. She didn't celebrate. There was no victory, only closure carved out of loss. Jerome's last glance at her in the courtroom was not of hatred but recognition, as if, for the first time, he saw her clearly. When it was over, Simone turned to her sister and said, "It's done." But Ilana didn't respond right away. She simply exhaled, her gaze drifting toward the light pouring through the courthouse window. "Then maybe," she whispered, "I can rest." Simone brushed away a tear and nodded. The sun outside was warm, bright, relentless, the kind of light that exposed everything. As they stepped into it together, hand in hand, the world that had once kept Elena hidden now saw her in full, not as a ghost, but as a woman who had survived the dark long enough to bring the truth into the light. For a brief golden moment, Alana Whitlock became the name on everyone's lips. Her face, pale, delicate, framed by silver hair, appeared on television screens, newspapers, documentaries. The world was captivated by the woman who had been hidden for 3 decades yet emerged with the soul of a poet. Publishers scrambled to reissue Jerome's old novels under her rightful authorship. Readers devoured her words, stunned to discover that the genius they had admired belonged not to a man of refinement, but to a woman who had written by candlelight in a locked attic. Simone watched the headlines with quiet awe. The ghostwriter of Savannah, they called her, a title both haunting and triumphant. Crowds gathered at bookshops where her story was told. People wept at her courage. Artists painted her portrait. Universities wanted to teach her work. For once, the world seemed to be setting things right. Yet, amid all the noise, Alana herself stayed quiet. She rarely smiled for cameras, never spoke at events. She preferred to sit by the window, wrapped in a blanket, watching the Spanish moss sway gently in the breeze. "They see the writer," she told Simone one evening. "But they'll never know the years it took to survive long enough to write." As the weeks passed, Simone began to notice a shadow settling over her sister's strength. Alana's health, already fragile, began to fade. Some mornings she couldn't get out of bed. Her hands trembled too much to hold a pen. Doctors said her body was simply exhausted. Malnutrition, trauma, and stress had worn it down beyond repair. Simone stayed by her side, reading aloud from her stories, as if the words might stitch her sister back together. "Do you ever hate him?" Simone asked one night, her voice barely above a whisper. Alana's tired eyes drifted toward the window, where the moonlight painted the room in silver. "I did," she said softly, "for years. But hating him kept me in the dark. Writing was my way out. That's what I want you to remember." Simone nodded, tears blurring her vision. She wanted to promise her sister that everything would be all right, but even she knew that truth had its own cost. The body can only carry so much pain before it decides to let go. Still, she held on to hope, fragile, trembling, but alive. Then, one gray morning, the phone rang. Simone's world fell silent as the words reached her. "Miss Whitlock, we're sorry." Alana passed away in her sleep. She dropped the receiver. The sound it made against the floor felt like the closing of a final chapter. Hours later, the police arrived with a letter, Alana's last words. It was written in the same soft handwriting Simone had first discovered in that hidden notebook. "Dear sister," it began. "If you are reading this, it means I finally stepped into the light. Don't cry for me. I was already gone long before they found me, but you gave me back my voice. You made the world remember that I existed. Please, publish the last manuscript in the box under the attic table. It is the only story I ever wrote about myself. Sign it under my true name, Lucia Whitlock. That was the name I dreamed of using when I was young. Tell them the ghost finally learned to live." Simone pressed the letter to her chest, her sobs silent and endless. The woman who had lived unseen had left behind a legacy brighter than anything her captor could ever steal. Weeks later, the final manuscript was published. It was titled 30 Years of Silence and bore the name Lucia Whitlock across its cover in elegant script. The book became an instant sensation, not because of its scandal, but because of its soul. Every page pulsed with truth, pain, and resilience. Simone attended the first launch event alone, standing before a crowd of hundreds as she read her sister's words aloud. No wall can cage a spirit that still remembers how to dream. When she finished, the audience rose in quiet applause, not for fame or spectacle, but for reverence. In that moment, Simone realized her sister hadn't died a ghost. She had become a voice echoing far beyond the attic that once confined her. And as she left the stage, she looked up at the night sky above Savannah, whispering softly into the wind, "You're free now, Alana. You're free." Months passed, but the echo of Alana's story refused to fade. Across the world, her name, Lucia Whitlock, became synonymous with courage, survival, and truth. Her book, 30 Years of Silence, was translated into dozens of languages. Readers found pieces of themselves in her pain, her endurance, her quiet defiance against the darkness that tried to erase her. Simone often received letters from strangers, survivors of abuse, silenced artists, people who had lived in fear but found hope in Alana's words. "Your sister taught me that even forgotten voices matter," one woman wrote. Simone would read them all, her heart aching with both pride and sorrow. She missed her sister fiercely, her gentle humor, her quiet strength. But she knew Alana's story had done something rare. It had transcended tragedy. What began as a nightmare in the attic had become a beacon for countless others who once believed no one could hear them. And though the house still stood old, heavy, filled with ghosts, it no longer frightened her. It was a monument now, a silent witness to the price of truth and the power of love that refused to die. Simone decided to preserve the house exactly as it was, turning it into a small literary foundation, the Whitlock Trust for Hidden Voices. Students, writers, and survivors visited to read, to heal, to learn how art could bloom even from confinement. In the attic, Simone left everything untouched, the desk, the lamp, the stack of yellowed papers. She placed a small plaque on the wall that read, "Here, words lived when their author could not." Visitors often said they felt something up there, not sorrow but peace, as if the room itself had exhaled after years of holding its breath. Every evening, Simone would climb the stairs, sit beside her sister's old desk, and light the lamp. She'd whisper, "We're still writing, Alana," before closing her eyes in quiet reflection. The world below moved on. New books, new stories, new scandals. But this attic had finally transformed from a prison into a sanctuary of remembrance. One afternoon, as sunlight filtered through the window, Simone found herself leafing through a folder she hadn't noticed before. Inside were fragments of an unfinished manuscript, lines of prose, half-formed thoughts, ideas scribbled in the margins. At the bottom of one page, Alana had written, "Freedom is now leaving the cage. It's realizing the door was never locked." Simone read the line over and over, tears welling in her eyes. It struck her that, in a strange way, her sister had never been entirely imprisoned. Her spirit, her imagination, had always been free, writing stories that reached far beyond the attic walls. Simone decided to finish the manuscript herself, not as an author, but as a sister continuing a conversation that death couldn't silence. "For Lucia," she wrote on the first page, "who taught me that the truest freedom begins within." Years later, when Simone grew old, people would ask her how she managed to live with so much loss. She would smile softly and say, "It wasn't loss, it was transformation." She spent her final days surrounded by shelves of her sister's books, letters from readers, and the soft hum of the attic lamp burning through another Savannah night. When she passed, her ashes were placed beside Elena's under the magnolia tree behind the house, two sisters who had finally found peace, side by side beneath the same sky. And though time moved on, Every person who stepped into the old Whitlock home could feel it, the faint warmth of words that refused to die, the echo of two voices whispering through the dust. We are free now.